What's up, y'all? It's B Dougie from GitHub, and I've got another Open Source Friday for you. Now, these videos are a way for you to learn about open source projects and the folks that contribute to them. And today we have Helen, lead developer from WordPress, who's going to be focusing on how she's leveraging GitHub Actions to improve her developer workflow for herself, as well as for the contributors to WordPress and WordPress plugins. So I hope you enjoy. If you haven't done already, like and subscribe. And be sure to save the Open Source Friday playlist if you're interested in keeping up to date on how to contribute to open source and how other folks are doing it as well. So enjoy.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Helen. It's good to be here.
Do you want to briefly talk about your background, how you got to programming, and then how you got to WordPress as well?
Sure. Yeah. This is the part that people always really like, I feel like. My background's in music. So I have my undergrad and my master's degrees in music. And I've given talks, it's like self-promotion, I guess, but I've given talks about the skills that I learned as a musician and how they translated to being a really good, hopefully a really good open source software developer and programmer. So what ended up happening, I feel like it's important for people to hear this stuff. So when I finished grad school, it was like, I don't know what to do with myself and I need like a paycheck and health insurance, And so they were hiring a web developer at the music conservatory that I had gone to. And so I applied and I'd had some background tinkering with web stuff and programming. But really was like a trained musician, but they hired me, figuring, the stuff I knew about the school gave me a serious advantage because you can learn programming and pick it up. I started this project migrating us to WordPress because we had budget stuff. So it was like 2008, right? So everybody had like budget problems because of the recession. And so we were having some budget stuff and, around software and whatever. And so we were like, oh yeah, like WordPress makes sense. And there's this like multi-site thing where every like department or office could have its own little like piece of the site and like manage their own stuff. And we don't have to buy them like Adobe licenses and whatever. So I started developing stuff on WordPress. And then went to a WordCamp where I met a ton of really cool WordPress people and was like, oh, this is like an open source thing where I could contribute myself. What does that mean? And then, I don't know, several months later, made my first patch for WordPress because of a miscolored border, I think. And it was merged and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Subversion's kind of weird, but it's pretty cool. So yeah, and then just kind of got sucked into it and started working as like a full-time WordPress developer at an agency, which is where I still am now. It's been almost 10 years. And wow. Yeah, it's just been a ride.
It sounds like you learned a lot of this on the job as like part of a need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the really cool thing about like web development. So just for like full transparency, I did take like computer science in high school, like AP computer science, and that was C++ based. And then I did one semester as a music and computer science double major and hated computer science. But I did have one semester of Java. But I do have some like very basic underpinnings of like, programming logic and that kind of stuff. But that's what's so cool about the web, I feel like, is that, when you start out with learning stuff like C++ and Java, everything's compiled, right? And so it's just this like huge ramp to like something that looks and feels interesting, right? But on the web, you can have a website up and running like immediately, right? And I'm from the GeoCities era. So for me, that idea of that instant gratification, right? Of like, and especially something like PHP where it just like runs, there's no build, there's nothing. It's just, you edit the PHP and it's there.
Yeah, is working with WordPress still in that same vein where you can just edit PHP files and it sort of works?
Yeah, for a lot of use cases. Yeah, it's still just, PHP. So.
Excellent. And Zach Katz mentions in the chat, SVN still remains weird.
Yes, that might be a good segue into the actions that I wrote, I guess,
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
want to
I would love to
just
talk
jump right
about
into it.
that, but there's also a question about your shirt too as well. Folks are asking about what's on
Yeah,
there.
yeah. So my shirt says, "It's an honor just to be Asian." This is a Sandra Oh quote. There's also a Canadian version because she's Canadian where it has like honor with the extra U in it. But yeah, this is my shirt. So this is important to me.
Excellent. Well, thanks
Yeah.
for wearing it and thanks for sharing and thanks for the question in the chat too as well, folks. But yeah, we got connected through the GitHub Actions. So did you want to share and what you've been working on?
Also, for background for the chat, I live in San Jose, Costa Rica, so sometimes my lag can get a little bit bad just because of like physical location. So GitHub Actions for WordPress. So when Actions came out as like, I think it was when it was like in closed beta phase. Like I try to keep on top of like things that are coming, and like, what are some interesting things that we can do? And that's really like my job as director of open source initiatives, is to keep an eye out for those sort of like opportunities to, better the open source community, to push ourselves forward, like both as a company and the broader WordPress community, right? And our relationship to like, what is open source? What does it mean? And so when I saw the action stuff coming, there were two things going on. One was that, like, hopefully this isn't controversial to say, but at the time, I think this was right around the time the Travis sale to like private equity was announced.
It was right before, yeah.
When the Travis thing hit, it was like, ooh, like we need to think about like, what if something happens here, right? And like we need to make moves somewhere else. And then also, this is just something that could solve a lot of problems, right? So on the WordPress side, I thought, the number one pain point that I hear from the broader ecosystem, right? So like I work on the core software, there's like the whole movement to like contribute to WordPress and all of that. But I think the broader ecosystem of WordPress, both commercial and free, is really where the power of WordPress is, right? And so one of the biggest places that is with plugin developers. And when I say a lot, I mean like 50, 60,000 free plugins in the central WordPress.org plugin repository. And these are people volunteering their time, right, and their energy to make that happen. And so one of the things you hear a lot is that it's really hard to remember how to do stuff in Subversion. So like, especially now. So like 10 years ago, more of us were using Subversion across different projects or whatever. But today it's like, I would say it's super uncommon to see Subversion. I would say the vast majority of time with version control, you're going to see Git these days. And then you'll see I see some Mercurial hanging around here and there, but like you just don't see Subversion in use anymore. And so when you're not using it on a regular basis, it's really hard to remember like, what are these commands that I have to run? What folder do I operate out of? Like, how does this work, right? And so I thought, a really cool thing would be to take where people are now. So a lot of people are developing their stuff on GitHub, right? Running their process, doing the code, all of that right there on GitHub. So why not bridge between GitHub and the Subversion repository, right? So like WordPress.org does need to remain the source of truth, right? Because we're not serving downloads directly from like an external source.
Yeah.
But we could bridge it, right? And so my thought was, okay, I'm pretty good at writing, half-baked bash scripts that get the stuff done. So why not do that here? And so that's what I did. I wrote like a little bash script. So I have this, this is like an umbrella repo at tetup/actions-WordPress. So this is an umbrella. It does have these directories that have the original actions in them. You can see they haven't been updated for 2 years. This was before the marketplace listings, and the marketplace listings require that each action live in its own repo. So we had to split them out just, for discoverability. But we do have this umbrella repo that lists what we do have. And so I'm going to talk through, there are 3 things in here. And so the one that I think is the most interesting to people is this deploying a plugin to the WordPress.org repository. And that's here, again, in its own little repo. And so there's a whole README, but basically what you need to do is you set an SVN username and an SVN password secret in your repository. These are your repository settings. These are encrypted, and I don't know, Brian, you probably know more about like how exactly all this works. But you set these secrets. What's really great about that is that you can set, like you could create just a committer user, right? Like you don't necessarily even need to add like your own actual credentials. So like for 10up plugins, we have like a 10up bot user that is just the committer on these. And that way, if something happens, we can revoke it for everything, right?
Yeah.
Nice and easy. So instead of going one by one. And so you set some stuff, and you can set up a file for excluding files. And so this is really helpful for if you do a build, right? So you could like exclude source files, that sort of thing. And then there are some sample baseline files. So with Actions, some people here probably are pretty good with Actions, but like are kind of skeptical about WordPress. And there are probably some people here who are really into WordPress, but have like no idea what I'm talking about with Actions. And so what Actions does is you have what's called a workflow file that defines some things that you need a GitHub computer to do for you.
Yeah.
Right. And so what we have here is we have some example workflow files, and I'll just talk through this one. So this one, what it says is like anytime you create a release, publish a release on GitHub. So this is like in the GitHub UI where you can create, like make a new release and it creates a tag with it. So anytime you make a new release on GitHub, it's going to spin up an Ubuntu machine, so a fancy little GitHub computer. It's going to check out the code. This is literally doing like a git clone of the tag that you've just created in the release. And then you can run build. So here, this run command, this is just executing commands on the command line, basically. Right. So we're doing the npm install, npm run build, and then this is where my action runs. So this is the 10up action WordPress plugin deploy, and this is where it actually runs, and I'll talk through what it actually does. And then we have one argument where you can generate zip true, some environment variables with your username and password. And then that runs, and that part itself does the stuff to deploy to Subversion. And then if you've generated a zip, it will upload it to the release right here in this step. So that's what the workflow does. And so you commit that to a specific place in your plugin repository.
So this
what
workflow
this action
here
actually does. Oh.
Sorry, just to I don't mean to slow you down a bit, but the workflow, is this a process you're already doing manually in like another environment?
Oh man, yes. It's replacing things that I would have had to run locally.
Okay.
And then like copy stuff between folders, and again remember like where stuff belongs.
Okay, gotcha. So you're basically being able to automate a portion of the workflow that would take more steps, perhaps, but through the sort of releases event workflow on GitHub Actions. And then also, curious, in the chat, we do have quite a few people here today too as well. So if you know Actions, let me know in the chat if you're familiar with Actions. If you do not know anything about Actions, let us know in the chat. We can slow down, speed up, and also same thing with WordPress. Any WordPress developers currently listening to this?
Yeah, I'm totally happy to take questions. I do have it open here on the side, excellent. So I'll look over every once in a while. Yeah, so I'm not going to walk like step by step through a bash file. Yes, I will talk about the hook docs. So this bash file, it's doing a lot of stuff that you would have had to do manually previously, like locally. You would have to be like, okay, if I have an assets directory, where does it go? Because the plugin repository, so each plugin has its own it's actually one mono repo. All those like 60,000 plugins is a single Subversion repository, and that's where Subversion actually works well for that case, because Subversion allows you to check out just one subfolder and assign permissions based on subfolders, so you can kind of like operate within just one area.
I've heard stories.
Yeah, they're also bad stories, but for this case, it does work well. And so you kind of have to remember in your actual plugin directory itself, there is a top level assets folder, then tags, branches, and trunk. And so trunk represents what would be like your main branch in Git. So it can reflect a development state, and then the tags themselves would reflect like actual releases that are packaged into zips and served up for download. And then sometimes people you have like an assets directory, right, in your actual plugin, and so you kind of get into this mess of like, which are my actual plugin assets, which are the assets that are specific for the plugin directory, right? And so we kind of do some magic here to move stuff between a specifically named folder. There is a setting for it. And then we do all the Subversion stuff for you. Like we check out your Subversion repository based on a slug, and then it'll copy files over, respecting whichever ignore file that you decide to use. Dist ignore is probably the one that most people want to use at this point. So copies that stuff over, copies over those specific plugin repository directory assets into the right place, adds everything in Subversion, checks the status. It copies the tag for you from trunk to the tag. That's a part that many people either forget to do, or else they like actually copy the directory locally and add it. But there is Subversion copy as a command, so you don't have to like copy the files yourself. Does some more Subversion stuff, and then it commits those to Subversion for you with a little message. And then if you've opted to generate a zip, it'll create a zip of that same plugin deployment, and that's what it does. And so those are all the steps that you would have done previously manually, right? Like you would have run the build locally, copied the necessary files over, remembering which ones you actually need, having to add them in Subversion. And then, having to commit them into the right place, create the tag in Subversion, right? All these things that like people just don't remember to do because it's a lot of steps, and you don't use Subversion all the time. So this just does it for you. You create a new release on GitHub, and it just puts it out there for you. I use it a lot because I maintain a lot of plugins through 10up, and that's how it goes. So I have an example here. I updated this plugin recently. And so, this is my little action run. It took 1.5 minutes, and all I had to do was create a new GitHub release, and it put it out there for everybody. So with the build and everything. So that makes me really happy.
There's a question in the chat. I'm not sure if it's a meme or a question, but SVN greater than or better than Git.
I will tell you, there are a couple things that I do like about Subversion. I do like that Subversion's revision numbers are sequential. I understand why Git uses hashes and all that stuff, but when your revision numbers are sequential, it actually gives you like a human insight into like how old something is, right? Was it a commit from a really long time ago, or was it something super recent? And I just feel like that's a little more human and easy to understand off the bat, rather than like having to jump around, and like every Git management tool has to build its own little like jump to the commit before this one UI, right? Because you can't just like back up sequentially.
I still don't understand the whole Git magic of like when I open my Git log and understanding like why is this commit over here and not like right before it. The way it works, it's something I've never looked into it, but also I don't really have the bandwidth to really dig into it because I got some other stuff I got to work on. But SVN is something that I don't have a lot of experience with, but I've chatted with Project Scara, and they had they actually migrated to GitHub. Actually, they didn't migrate to GitHub. They migrated to like a WordPress setup where they do have a mirror on GitHub. And they use Mercurial, so they had to do something similar, but not with Actions. But it's a similar process if you're looking to leverage GitHub for your projects, but you might have a whole community somewhere else. Which I wanted to ask too as well, because it might not be clear. This is a GitHub Twitch stream and a channel as well, but WordPress currently not on GitHub.
No, well. Sure, I'll just talk about it. WordPress, the way we run things is, the central source of truth for the WordPress core software is on Subversion hosted on WordPress.org servers.
Yeah.
This Subversion repository gets mirrored to a Git repository also on WordPress.org. That Git repository is then mirrored onto GitHub.
Okay.
And then on GitHub, you can submit pull requests.
Oh, nice.
You just have to attach them to a track ticket. So we use track for actual like issue management. Lots of reasons. And there are some things that I like about track much more than GitHub issues. So this is kind of like an internal struggle. But yeah, you can, no, you don't need to attach a zip. So there's a field in track. And also I think we do some magic association. So if you just mention the full like track ticket URL in the PR on GitHub, it'll associate it for you. And it syncs back like the PR status, like check status, and I think review comments back over to track. So we're kind of syncing stuff back and forth.
Is it similar to the way you were deploying with GitHub Actions? Is there another sort of tool that's powering the sort of syncing?
There is a tool. I don't know what it does. I don't work on .org infrastructure. So yeah, somebody wrote something that associates all these things. It's pretty clever. So we do have that going on. So you can contribute code through GitHub. And we do use GitHub Actions in the core software to run tests now because we got like super, I don't know. There's not a nice way to say it. We just had problems with Travis. So we ran into like an emergency sort of situation. We had to like swap everything over this space of like 2 weeks.
Okay.
So we're on GitHub Actions now for testing as well. And we're like sort of slowly expanding. The editor project is its own repo, and so we have this block editor. So yes, most of WordPress is like largely PHP based, but the editor is written in React. It's called Gutenberg. So
I was going to say,
WordPress.
Was that Gutenberg?
Yeah. So Gutenberg runs as like a parallel project, right? We, periodically sync it back. But Gutenberg is like, it's like a mono repo. It releases actually to many NPM packages from that one large repo. And that entire development process, the entire cycle, runs on GitHub.
Okay.
And they run a ton of actions for a lot of things: cleanup, deployment, releasing, all kinds of stuff. And so, so as a project, like we very much, it's hard to balance because we very much believe in open source and the stewardship of it and using open source software ourselves, right? And, GitHub is a service where the service side is not open source. And so that's like a constant conflict for us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one of our values is there's the democratizing publishing that we talk about, like for the software goals. But like as an open source community, that's also our goal, right? To be as inclusive as possible. And sometimes that does mean that you have to go where the contributors are. Right. You have to go where people are comfortable, where people are able to do their best work with fewer barriers. And so right now, this is where we are. Right. Yeah. And so we just constantly evaluating like what are the best tools to like accomplish that.
It's also fair to point out too is WordPress predates the existence of GitHub too as well. WordPress has been around and they had systems and SVN as well existing. So at the time, and when you were getting involved in 2008, to attach yourself, which was when GitHub showed up as well, attach yourself to the new shiny thing might not be the best for the community. It might be best to figure out, WordPress turns 18 in May. Excellent.
Yes, Henry knows. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and like I respect that too as well. And like I don't want it to be like, why is WordPress not on GitHub? Like that was not really the mention for the question, but I wanted to make sure folks were educated and that there are other ways people are doing open source. So just know that those are the ways if you want to get involved. But I think there's a nice little on-ramp. If you do go to contribute with WordPress and you join the community, you'll be kind of shepherded into that situation.
Yes.
Also, Gutenberg looks amazing. I haven't even looked at it, the editor, in such a long time, and it's it's a beautiful editor. And I spent some time working on CMSs at my previous employer, Netlify, and I mean WordPress's editor is like the thing that we point to as like a great experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like for full disclosure, TenUp actually did the redo of the GitHub blog. I don't think we like continue to do work on it, but you are on WordPress. We made it
Yes.
happen for you. So
GitHub.com/blog. It's a WordPress
yeah.
blog.
Yep. All right. So I guess back to actions.
Yeah, let's just get
Um,
back into action.
Yeah. One other thing to mention, I'll just mention this one briefly, is there's also a parallel action, which is an asset updater. So sometimes with your WordPress plugins, it might continue working, right? Especially because we have this like commitment to backwards compatibility in the software, which is double-edged sword. But sometimes you need to just update your plugin to say it's still compatible with the latest version of WordPress, right? So you don't need to tag a whole release. You don't need anything. It's just like updating one line in a README file. So there's also a parallel action that needs some love right now. So I need to get back to it. But the intention of it is that it goes through like anytime you commit something to the primary branch. So this is sort of assuming more of like a Git flow work style where you have like an integration develop style branch, right? And then you have like your main or trunk is actually what I name it so that it's very clear this is what syncs back to trunk on Subversion.
Yeah.
And so anytime you make a commit to that deployment branch, right, the like release branch, it goes through and it checks and it says like, does this have any differences from the Subversion repository other than README and asset files? And if not, then it will go ahead and deploy just those README and asset files for you, which is also pretty slick. So again, you just like update the stuff in your release branch and it will put that out there for you. So you don't have to remember Subversion. You don't even have to check it out locally. Like you could do all of that just in the browser, right? Like you just edit the README in the browser and be done. So that's super nice. And then the thing that I think a lot of people don't know about, and I think has been picking up more interest recently, is what are called hook docs. So in WordPress, we have what are called hooks. React people, there are also hooks in React now. But WordPress...
Was that in... Well, the hook term is being used a lot in the JavaScript world at the moment as frameworks. But it's a similar construct when you think of hooks in WordPress?
Yes. Hooks in WordPress are very similar to the way they work in jQuery. I think if for people who maybe lived in jQuery land back in the day or today, I don't know. So they're the same thing. So in WordPress, there are two types. We have filters and actions. And so an action is something that it says, hey, I've reached this point. Here's a place where you can say, I want to execute some code right in this moment, right at this point in this action. And then it has what are called filters. And what a filter does is it provides an original value of something and it allows you to alter that value so that going forward, the next part of the code path has this altered value for you. So those are the two types of WordPress hooks. And one of the hardest things, especially when you get into like custom development, is trying to find all those hooks. So like, how do I know what action runs where? How do I know what parameters are passed to this filter so that I can like, change my content based on, the post ID or something, right? And so the WordPress core software project spent years documenting all of the hooks and then creating a generated hook documentation resource. And that's actually, I'll just developer.wordpress.org. And there's a code reference here. And so this is where you can see all of these. These are hooks. So this one's a filter, for instance, so block type metadata. So metadata associated with a type of block. And you can alter that array of metadata based on whatever it is that you need to do. So these are hook docs that WordPress core software has, but in your custom plugins, right, and especially for large plugin projects or ones that are geared toward developers and meant to be extended using hooks, what do? for creating documentation. So I have an action. I'm going to show you what the output looks like first. So this is a plugin that I maintain through Tenup called Classify. It's like to bring ML AI stuff services to your WordPress site, so it can like automatically generate alt tags for images and that sort of thing. I think it's super cool, but I'm not here to like sell you on my plugin. You can ask questions about it. But what we have here is we generate this documentation, and it's hosted on GitHub Pages. So you can see it's tenup.github.io/classify. And so this is just hosted on GitHub Pages. And what we have here is all of our actions and filters right here. So let's say we want to check out this one. Classify should classify post, right? So this shows you like, what does the call look like? Gives you some plain text description. All of this is generated from the PHP. This is all inline documentation that is pulled out and turned into these cute little static pages. So it tells you what kind of parameters you have, the type of the parameter, what it is. So like this case, we default to true, like, yes, we should try to classify this post. But you could say like, I'm going to make it false if it's tagged with something in particular, right? So you can go through and kind of detect that and be like, okay, actually, I'm going to set this to false, because it gives you the post ID. So you could like retrieve all the information about the post and be like, okay, based on this piece of information in the post data, I don't want to actually run the classification. So this is what hook documentation can look like. And again, this is all auto-generated. So what I have here is, this actually is not an action that I wrote. This is using other people's actions. And that's what's so cool to me about GitHub Actions, is that like, I don't necessarily have to script anything myself. I can go and get some different pieces and put them together into something that does what I need it to do. So rather than providing an action, what I have here is I just have a documentation page, a markdown file explaining to you how this works. And so what you need to do is, it does use a JS doc standard. That sounds very weird. We're putting JS doc standard on PHP doc. They're extremely similar. There's only really one difference, which is, there are two differences. One is one of the app parameters, and then the other is like, it has curly braces around the type. But it's like super, super simple to kind of format it that way if you want to use this. And so it explains what you need. This JS doc formatted doc blocks. You create a build command in your NPM, typically in your package JSON file, a hook.conf configuration file, the workflow file, and then you need a personal access token because of deploying to GitHub Pages. I don't know if this has changed yet. I know that they were talking about it, but right now, or as of the last time I checked, you needed to generate a personal access token to actually be able to deploy to GitHub Pages. And so it just talks about like, what do you need to do for templating? What are some other options that are there? How to test it locally. It's super easy to test locally. And then here's some examples of what a doc block looks like. With, again, the minor differences from the PHP doc standard. What some parts of your package JSON might look like, what the configuration might look like for you. Again, it's very, very small. And then an example workflow file. And so in the workflow, you can see, again, all we do is we check it out. We set up Node to be the correct version. Sometimes I don't check this stuff. I don't know if this is still necessary. At the time it was. We do the install, we run the build, right? This is the command we added to our package JSON. And then after we run the build, it deploys it to GitHub Pages. Just like that. And so what the build command is doing, I guess I should show, but yeah, it just does that. It builds into a directory called hook docs, and then that directory is then deployed to GitHub Pages. It's like magic. And it's super cool. So that makes me really happy. And I've started to see people talking about like, how do I, provide people with developer documentation? And I just think that, again, we're on GitHub as developers, right? And so to be able to kind of leverage the same platform that we're already on and use GitHub Pages, which lots of plugins, like, we're not doing anything with GitHub Pages as it is. So why not put the hook documentation there, right? And so that's been super fun for me, is like figuring out, again, what's something that could be usable for everybody, solves my problems, but also should solve a lot of other people's problems.
Yeah, and I think the one thing you pointed to as well is the fact that you had just a markdown page of explaining how it works
Yeah.
and the workflow. The fact that, again, we are on GitHub, you could, I was going to say the steal ideas, but I guess, yeah, steal ideas. As long as the MIT or something open license, you can steal it all to your heart's content. But being able to build on what's already there, I think is like
Yeah.
where the real win is there.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it as like putting like Lego together, right? It's like, here's a bunch of stuff that exists for me. Like, I don't have
Yeah.
to do, like, I don't have to inject the plastic myself, right? Like, I don't have to do that. I just grab the bricks and put them together and it does the thing that I want it to do. And so that's what I've really been enjoying about messing with GitHub Actions. Cause like historically, I'm kind of like a DevOps dummy. Like I'm really good at breaking stuff. I'm famous for it. I'm really good at breaking stuff. And so for me to be able to like actually figure this out and provide something that's helpful has been fun for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did also point out that Dimension Data has better, which is borrow the code rather than steal it. I think that's better. And
Yeah.
Philadelphia, welcome from Royal Town. I'm not really sure where that is, but thanks for calling it out. And the other thing that you also mentioned too is around the understanding that things like Gutenberg and how it's using React and JavaScript and on GitHub, the full experience is there, and acknowledging that like there is a movement of people doing open source on GitHub. Maybe other people have noticed, but the fact that we're able to tap into all that skill and talent, because I also don't come from a SRE background. I kind of just really picked it up when I joined GitHub because a lot of that sort of DevOps stuff, I had other people at the company I work for that did that much easier and faster than I did. So I just fixed stuff that broke if I broke it, but move away as fast as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
I'm curious though, from your vantage point, and do you see other WordPress devs who are tapped into the sort of idea with GitHub Actions and powering their deployments of their plugins and stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely. So I know internally at 10up, like we do have some like actual like CD going on. So like we're using it to deploy places. I get, the plugin deployment is also sort of like that, but you don't tag plugins nearly as often as like you deploy a website, right? So I do see people doing that. I know that there are some other people who do a lot of work on the core software as well and are like me and also work at agencies, right? So like there are a number of us who are like sponsored through agencies or plugin development shops, and we're sponsored to work on WordPress, which is a big part of that ecosystem as well. So I do know that there are a lot of people who work on things like linting actions. We have like a specific PHPCS, so like coding standards specific to WordPress styles. And so integrating that and taking advantage of annotations, which I think are really freaking cool in the way that those can run on GitHub. So if people haven't seen this, I should have pulled up an example, but if you haven't seen this, like if somebody sets up linting correctly in using GitHub Actions. There are other services that'll do it, but honestly, like it's just easier to just run it on GitHub. It supports annotations. And so what it does is instead of just like spitting out a report of like, here are the lines and like the problems that were on those lines, it actually injects this directly into the PR view. So like when you're in the code view in a PR under line 13 in your PR, it'll be like, here was a PHP coding standard error, you're missing a space or something, right? And it does this like inline in the code review view in a PR. And so like if you're the contributor or the maintainer, you can go through and like apply those changes. Like again, in the web UI, which is a thing that I'm really on about, is that's a big part to me of like, how do you include as many contributors as possible, right? Is understanding that your contributor base may only have one device, right? So like, and especially like newer generations, like they may only have a phone, right? They may not even have like their own computer, or they're on like a Chromebook or something where you don't actually have like system access, right? All you have is a browser, right? It's very common. Or maybe it's somebody whose only access is through like their local library or something, right? And these are all people who are perfectly valuable, have just as much to say. And so this idea of like being able to bring more of this process into the web browser is super powerful, right? The ability to like do a code review, to apply small changes or make big changes. And then one of the other things like that GitHub is working on, I need to figure this out for WordPress. The code spaces stuff is
Yeah.
super cool to me. Yeah, because to me, it's this idea of like, what I haven't figured out is how to make it actually run a WordPress site, because WordPress stores the site URL in the database. So I haven't figured out that part yet with the port forwarding. But
Is
like imagine.
WordPress, sorry, now I'm trying to be your solutions engineer. The database that WordPress uses, is it SQL based or a certain flavor?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder if you could use one of the cloud. So if it would it be SQL-like? Could you use that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Probably not.
Yeah, because I've been playing around with a lot of cool these hosted SQL or Postgres database solutions,
Right.
and this is like outside of my work at GitHub, but like I've been playing around like some of the Postgres solutions like PlanetScale and Superbase that you can just pipe it to a URL that's already hosted. It could be a solution. It just depends.
Yeah, I think the problem I was running into is that because we store, well, what we do is we store the site URL in the database. And so with port forwarding and code spaces, it's like dynamically generating a URL. And so I have not figured out how you can get that URL and then shove it into the database or write it into a config file as an override so that you can actually access the WordPress site through the port forwarding.
Yeah. I should introduce you to someone on the team, and they can help you out with that.
Make it work for me. Yeah, that's what this is all about, right? It's like finding the right people. But yeah, like just imagine that, you're working on something as complex as the editor, right? Which is this huge React app, and you want to test a change, but you're like on the go, or like I'm a parent, right? So like I might be like sitting in my kitchen on my iPad or something. Yeah. And so the idea that like I could spin up a remote environment that does the build from that pull request, from that branch, whatever, and be able to test it like wherever I am on whatever device I have, or if I need to do mobile testing, right, and not have to worry about like building it locally, trying to set up a web server inside my house, or whatever. So if I want to do this sort of mobile testing, to be able to do it all through, one place again, is super powerful to me. And so that's like, I think to me, that's probably like my next big thing that I need to dive into on the like, how does WordPress use GitHub front?
Yeah. But this was a fun conversation. I really enjoyed learning about WordPress, learning about your use of actions to sort of keep the system or the lights on, I guess. But yeah, it's nice to look over the shoulders of other developers and see how they're sort of solving problems. So